Life in Salem
We
during the
gather here
1690s
today,
was not just difficult,
under the
it
watchful
was
eyes of the
suffocating.
mountains and the silent
Imagine a
witness of
community
the
where
snow.
every action, every word,
I
and
reckon we've
every
got a
glance
decision
was
to make.
scrutinized through the
And
unrelenting
it won't be
lens
an
of
easy one,
Puritan
that's for
piety.
sure.
The Puritans who settled in Massachusetts believed they were creating a city upon a hill, a model Christian society meant to shine with God's approval. But in practice, it meant that daily life was bound by rigid expectations and an unforgiving social order. Every morning began with prayer, every task was an act of devotion, and every hardship was interpreted as divine judgment. The community was small, isolated, and intensely watchful of its members, leaving no room for deviation. To live in Salem was to live inside a pressure cooker of fear and conformity, where even a minor step out of line could set off whispers, suspicions, and sometimes accusations that would haunt a family forever. The winters in New England were harsh and unyielding, with snow cutting the villagers off from outside help and making survival dependent on strict cooperation. Hunger, cold, and disease were constant companions. Families worked from dawn to dusk just to keep food on the table, and yet even hard labor was never enough to guarantee security. When crops failed or livestock died, it was rarely seen as mere bad luck. Instead, it was interpreted as a punishment from God, or worse, as the malicious work of the devil. This worldview fostered an environment where the natural and the supernatural blurred, where ordinary misfortune could easily be transformed into evidence of witchcraft. In such a world, to stand out in any way was dangerous. Religion was the bedrock of Salem's existence, but it was also the iron chain that kept everyone in line. The Puritan Church dictated not just worship but behavior, morality, and even thought. Ministers thundered from the pulpit about the lurking presence of Satan and the constant danger of damnation. Children were taught from the earliest age that sin was everywhere and that eternal punishment awaited the unrepentant. Women were expected to be obedient, silent, and pious, serving their households with humility. Men were judged by their ability to provide, lead, and display unwavering faith. In this climate, suspicion often fell hardest on those who did not fit neatly into these roles: widows, spinsters, the poor, and the outspoken. They became natural scapegoats, marked not because of what they had done, but because of who they were. Adding to this fragile structure were the festering rivalries between families. Land disputes were common, and farmland was both precious and limited. Neighbors often quarreled over property lines, inheritance, and livestock. Beneath the veneer of unity, resentment simmered. The witch trials did not begin in a vacuum, they erupted in a place already divided by personal grudges and competing ambitions. In many cases, the finger of accusation conveniently pointed at those whose property others coveted, or at rivals whose downfall would clear the way for greater influence. Witchcraft became a weapon, an instrument to settle old scores under the guise of spiritual warfare. For the children of Salem, life was equally stifling. Play was discouraged, frivolity was condemned, and imagination itself was seen as dangerous. They lived in a world of constant sermons, strict chores, and little affection. The harsh discipline of Puritan parents left no room for rebellion, but the human spirit found ways to resist. When the girls of Salem began to whisper, act strangely, and claim visions, they were doing more than simply falling ill or misbehaving. They were breaking out of the suffocating mold they had been forced into since birth. Their strange fits, interpreted as possession, were also expressions of fear, repression, and perhaps even the thrill of attention in a society where children were expected to remain silent. Another layer of fear was shaped by the brutal reality of the frontier. Salem was not far removed from ongoing conflicts with Native American tribes, many of whom had been displaced or brutalized by English settlers. Tales of raids, massacres, and burned villages traveled from the frontier to Salem, carried by refugees who had witnessed horrors firsthand. These stories planted images of bloodshed and terror in the minds of Salem's residents, intensifying their sense that Satan was actively at work against them. The psychological wounds of war mingled with religious dread, making the idea of a devil's conspiracy seem all the more real. For villagers who had lost loved ones in sudden, violent attacks, the notion of an unseen enemy operating within their own town was terrifying, but also believable. In Salem's fragile world, women occupied a particularly precarious position. They were believed to be spiritually weaker, more susceptible to temptation, and thus more likely to become instruments of Satan. A woman who was poor, argumentative, or independent could easily draw suspicion. A widow who controlled her own property might be seen as threatening to male authority. Even midwives, whose knowledge of healing should have been valued, could find themselves accused if a child died during birth. These attitudes reflected a deeper misogyny embedded in Puritan culture, where female independence was equated with danger. The witch trials would later highlight this inequality, but its roots were already firmly planted in everyday life. What made Salem extraordinary was not that it believed in witches. Belief in witchcraft was widespread in Europe and the colonies, but that the community's unique pressures combined to ignite an unparalleled hysteria. Religion, economics, fear of the unknown, and deep-seated grudges formed a volatile mixture. The villagers' need to explain their hardships, to justify their failures, and to find meaning in their suffering all converged in the figure of the witch. By defining an enemy, they could believe they had control, that their misfortunes were not random but the result of evil that could be named, captured, and punished. It was easier to blame witches than to accept the grim randomness of disease, famine, and war. This suffocating atmosphere, where faith and fear walked hand in hand, prepared the ground for what would follow. When strange symptoms appeared in young girls, when whispers turned into accusations, Salem was already primed to explode. The daily pressures of Puritan life, the relentless demand for purity, the crushing weight of survival, the simmering rivalries and grudges, all ensured that when hysteria came, it would come like a storm. What made the Salem Witch Trials possible was not just the belief in the devil, but the fragile and combustible society that had been built on fear, control, and suspicion. Salem's tragedy was not an accident, it was the inevitable outcome of a community living under unbearable tension, waiting for a spark. In the cold New England winter of 1692, the quiet order of Salem was broken not by soldiers or storms, but by the inexplicable behavior of two young girls. Betty Parris, the 9-year-old daughter of Reverend Samuel Parris, and her cousin Abigail Williams, only 11 years old, began to convulse, scream, and fall into fits that terrified their household. They writhed on the floor, contorted their bodies in unnatural ways, barked like dogs, and complained of stabbing pains invisible to anyone else. Neighbors whispered that the children were bewitched. Ministers and physicians were summoned, but no natural explanation could be found. When prayer failed to calm the children and medicine offered no cure, the villagers turned to the only explanation that fit their worldview: the devil had entered Salem. The strange behavior of these girls became the spark that ignited the most infamous witch panic in American history. Their fits were contagious, soon spreading to other young girls in Salem Village. More and more children began screaming in church, claiming to see dark figures, and crying out that witches were tormenting them. To the adults, it seemed clear that Satan's hand was upon them. The symptoms could not be explained away as mere mischief. The girls' convulsions were too violent, their cries too convincing. These children were seen as victims, not liars, and their accusations carried enormous weight. The question was no longer whether the devil was at work, but who in Salem had allowed him through the door. To us today, the symptoms seem far less mysterious. Historians and scientists have offered many theories about what might have caused the girls' behavior. Some suggest ergot poisoning, a mold that grows on rye grain and can trigger hallucinations, spasms, and strange sensations when consumed. Others argue that the trauma of frontier wars, where many Puritan families had witnessed raids, killings, and dismemberment, left psychological scars that could resurface as hysteria. Epilepsy, encephalitis, or even simple attention-seeking behavior have all been proposed. But in 1692, none of these explanations were available. To the Puritans, the line between natural illness and supernatural affliction was thin, and anything unexplained was attributed to the devil's interference. The power of suggestion played an enormous role. Once the community accepted that the girls were bewitched, others began to exhibit similar symptoms. Young women suddenly discovered they too could feel invisible pinches, see dark shapes, and collapse into seizures. The hysteria spread like wildfire because it gave the powerless a strange kind of authority. In a world where children and women had almost no voice, their suffering became evidence in court, their cries turned into weapons. When they pointed their fingers at neighbors, their words carried the weight of truth. What had begun as inexplicable fits became a performance, perhaps unconscious, perhaps intentional, that reshaped the entire village. It is easy to forget how terrifying these episodes must have seemed to ordinary people. Imagine being a farmer in Salem, watching your daughter fall to the ground, screaming that witches are stabbing her with spectral needles. Imagine the confusion of seeing multiple girls thrash in unison, claiming to see the same ghostly figures. In a society convinced of the devil's presence, these displays were not dismissed as childish games, they were evidence of a dark conspiracy threatening the soul of the entire community. Parents feared for their children's salvation, ministers feared for their flocks, and leaders feared for the future of their fragile settlement. The fact that the afflicted girls were so young gave their words unusual credibility. Children were seen as innocent vessels, less capable of deception. If they claimed witches were attacking them, who could doubt it? The more the girls screamed, the more the community believed them. Their symptoms became a theater of fear, performed in households, churches, and eventually in courtrooms. The public could not look away. With each new fit, each new vision, the sense of panic deepened. The girls' bodies became battlegrounds, living proof that Salem was under siege from forces it could not see. There was also an element of thrill in the chaos. These children, long suppressed by the rigidity of Puritan life, had suddenly found themselves at the center of attention. Their cries drew crowds, their words shaped the fate of adults, and their visions were treated as divine revelations. For the first time, they were listened to, feared, and even obeyed. Whether consciously or not, they understood the power they wielded, and they used it. Each fit added fuel to the fire, and the village became a stage on which fear and superstition played their deadly roles. The early symptoms were crucial because they shifted the burden of proof. Before Salem, witchcraft accusations often relied on misfortune, a cow dying, a crop failing, a neighbor falling ill. But here, the community had living, breathing bodies that seemed to display the devil's torment in real time. Every convulsion, every scream, every tear became evidence. The afflicted were not merely witnesses, they were living demonstrations of witchcraft's power. Their suffering turned abstract fears into visible horrors. In their bodies, the village saw proof of evil, and that proof demanded punishment. Modern readers may be tempted to dismiss the afflicted girls as frauds, but to do so is to miss the complexity of the moment. Some of their symptoms may have been genuine medical conditions. Some may have been psychological responses to fear and repression. And some may have been exaggerations, born out of the intoxicating power of being believed. What mattered in Salem was not whether the symptoms were real, but that they were accepted as real. Perception shaped reality. Once the community believed witches were tormenting children, the stage was set for accusations, trials, and executions. The strange symptoms of Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, and the other afflicted girls were not just peculiar episodes of illness. They were the spark that set Salem aflame. Their fits captured the imagination of a fearful community, giving physical form to anxieties that had long been building beneath the surface. Without these early cries, Salem might have remained a town of quiet rivalries and whispered suspicions. But with them, it became the stage for one of the darkest episodes in American history. The girls' suffering, whether genuine, imagined, or performed, transformed Salem's fears into action, and their voices would echo in the courts, on the gallows, and across centuries of history. The accusations began quietly, almost hesitantly, but once spoken aloud, they spread like wildfire across Salem. At first, the afflicted girls struggled to name who tormented them. Their fits were filled with screams of invisible specters, clawing shapes, and voices only they could hear. Pressed by ministers and neighbors to reveal who was responsible, they finally began to point fingers. The first three names they uttered would forever alter the course of Salem's history: Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. Each of these women occupied a vulnerable position in the community, making them convenient scapegoats. Sarah Good was a destitute beggar, despised for her habit of muttering under her breath as she walked through the village. Her poverty had already placed her on the margins of society, and her sharp tongue gave people reason to suspect her of bitterness. Sarah Osborne was a woman who had scandalized her neighbors by pursuing a relationship with an indentured servant after her husband's death. She had been absent from church for long periods, a grave offense in Puritan society. And then there was Tituba, the enslaved woman in Reverend Parris's household, a foreigner with strange customs and an outsider in every sense of the word. Each of them was vulnerable, each of them expendable, and their names provided the community with targets onto whom they could project their fears. When the accused were brought in for questioning, the process itself was more accusation than inquiry. Magistrates asked leading questions, pressing for confirmation that the devil had been at work. For Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, denial only seemed to deepen suspicion. Their resistance, their refusal to confess, was taken as proof that they were hardened in sin. But it was Tituba's testimony that changed everything. At first, she too denied the charges. But under pressure, and likely under the threat of severe punishment from Reverend Parris, she broke. Her confession was not just an admission of guilt, it was a dramatic tale of a vast conspiracy. She claimed that witches had gathered, that they served the devil, and that Salem was surrounded by evil forces. She described strange animals, black dogs, and spectral figures that tormented the children. The magistrates seized on her words as confirmation that their fears were justified. Tituba's confession was the turning point, the moment when suspicion transformed into full-blown hysteria. By admitting her own guilt and pointing to others, she not only saved herself from immediate execution but also validated the afflicted girl's visions. If witches truly walked among them, then anyone could be guilty. Her words opened the door to an expanding web of accusations, where one name led to another, and then another, in a chain that would eventually entangle hundreds. The logic of the trials fed on itself: the more people accused, the more real the threat appeared, and the more real the threat, the more people were accused. Confession became both a weapon and a shield. For the accused, admitting guilt, no matter how false, could mean survival. Those who confessed often escaped execution, instead being imprisoned and pressed into naming others. Those who denied their guilt, no matter how earnestly, faced the gallows. The paradox was cruel: truth led to death, while lies offered life. This twisted dynamic encouraged more confessions, each one adding fuel to the fire and expanding the circle of suspicion. Salem was caught in a feedback loop of fear, where every denial hardened belief and every confession confirmed it. As the accusations multiplied, the targets shifted from the marginalized to the respected. At first, the poor and the vulnerable bore the brunt, but soon even church-going women, prosperous landowners, and long-standing members of the community were accused. No one was safe. The girls claimed to see spectral shapes of neighbors hovering over their beds, or tormenting them in the night. Specters of townspeople were said to bite, choke, or prick them. And when those accused protested their innocence, the afflicted writhed and convulsed in court, declaring that the specters of the very people before them were at that moment tormenting them. The courtroom became a stage, where visible suffering seemed to prove invisible guilt. The web of accusations also revealed the underlying fractures of Salem society. Old grudges resurfaced in the form of witchcraft charges. Neighbors who had quarreled over livestock or property suddenly found themselves at the mercy of spectral testimony. A husband's feud with another family could suddenly result in his wife being accused. Personal resentments, grievances, and jealousies found expression in the language of witchcraft. What looked on the surface like spiritual warfare was often a mask for human conflicts, disputes over land, inheritance, or social standing, now cloaked in the terrifying language of the devil. The most chilling part of this spreading hysteria was the way it silenced dissent. To question the validity of the accusations was to risk becoming a suspect oneself. To defend a neighbor was to risk being accused of sharing their guilt. Fear policed every word, every gesture. In this atmosphere, suspicion was safer than loyalty, and betrayal became an act of survival. Families turned against one another, and friendships shattered. Salem was not just haunted by visions of witches, it was haunted by the collapse of trust, the unraveling of community bonds that had once held it together. What began with the strange behavior of a few children quickly escalated into a nightmare because of this widening web of accusations. Once names started circulating, there was no way to stop them. Each accusation justified the last, and each denial hardened the resolve of those who believed they were fighting Satan's army. Salem became trapped in its own logic, a self-reinforcing cycle where fear created evidence and evidence created fear. By the summer of 1692, the list of accused had grown so long that it included not only outcasts but respected church members, wealthy landowners, and even the wife of the colony's governor. What had begun with whispers in the night had grown into a storm that threatened to swallow the entire community. The web of accusations was not random. It was woven deliberately, through fear, through coercion, and through the willingness of neighbors to turn suspicion into survival. The story of Salem's witch trials is often remembered as hysteria, but it was also strategy, a dark game in which confession, accusation, and silence were all weapons. In Salem, words could kill. And once those words took root, they spread faster than any plague. Beneath the surface of Salem's hysteria lay a deeper struggle, one that had little to do with demons or witchcraft and everything to do with politics and power. To understand why the trials unfolded as they did, we must look at the fragile government of Massachusetts in the early 1690s. At the very moment when accusations of witchcraft began to spread, the colony itself was in turmoil. Its royal charter had been revoked by England, leaving the government in a state of confusion and weakness. Authority was fragmented, leadership was uncertain, and in this power vacuum, the witch trials became both a tool and a distraction. Salem's fear was not only spiritual, it was political. The division between Salem Village and Salem Town was one of the most important forces driving the crisis. Salem Town, a bustling port with merchants, trade, and wealth, leaned toward progress and commerce. Salem Village, however, was rural, agricultural, and deeply conservative, clinging to Puritan ideals with fierce devotion. The villagers felt overshadowed by the town, exploited by its wealthy elites, and left vulnerable on the frontier. These simmering resentments turned neighbors into enemies. The witch trials provided an outlet for these tensions, a way for rural Puritans to assert their moral authority over a community they feared was slipping into corruption. Each accusation carried with it not just religious overtones, but the sharp sting of local rivalry. At the center of these disputes stood Reverend Samuel Parris, minister of Salem Village. Parris was a deeply polarizing figure. Some parishioners admired his strict sermons and his unwavering battle against sin, while others despised his arrogance, his demands for higher wages, and his obsession with rooting out enemies within the congregation. He was locked in bitter conflict with several families in the village, particularly those aligned with the wealthier Salem Town. When his daughter Betty and niece Abigail began their fits, Parris seized upon the moment as evidence that his warnings of the devil's work had been correct all along. To support him was to stand with God, to oppose him was to risk being branded as Satan's ally. His enemies in the congregation suddenly found themselves vulnerable, their dissent transformed into suspicion. What might have been a petty parish squabble now became a matter of life and death. The trials also revealed how accusations of witchcraft could be harnessed for personal gain. Property in New England was not just land, it was survival, status, and legacy. When someone was convicted of witchcraft, their estate could be seized, leaving families destitute. Neighbors who long coveted another's fields could suddenly find themselves inheritors of land, not through inheritance or purchase, but through accusation. The targeting of prosperous farmers and respected townsfolk was not always a coincidence, it was a calculated move in the dangerous chess game of local politics. The fear of witches masked the hunger for land and power, and in Salem, the two were indistinguishable. This weaponization of the courts was aided by the legal chaos of the time. Massachusetts had no clear charter, no stable framework of law. The judges and magistrates who oversaw the trials operated in a vacuum, improvising procedures as they went. They relied heavily on spectral evidence, visions and dreams reported by the afflicted, because in the absence of established rules, fear became the standard of proof. Chief Justice William Stoughton, a man known for his severity, embraced this unorthodox approach, seeing it as a way to purge the colony of Satan's influence. His decisions gave legitimacy to the hysteria, and his authority shielded the accusers from challenge. The law was not a safeguard but a weapon, reshaped to serve the needs of those in power. Beyond Salem, the colony's leaders also found the trials useful. Massachusetts had recently endured devastating wars with French forces and native tribes, leaving its frontier communities shattered and vulnerable. The witch trials, with their dramatic confessions and public executions, shifted attention away from political failures and military defeats. They unified people under a single cause, rooting out the devil. In a strange way, the trials served as a form of propaganda, reinforcing the authority of colonial leaders by presenting them as guardians of righteousness. The panic was not only tolerated but encouraged, because it distracted from larger crises threatening the colony's stability. The rivalry between Salem Village's conservative farmers and Salem Town's ambitious merchants was mirrored in the very pattern of accusations. Many of the accused were connected, directly or indirectly, to the more prosperous, outward-looking faction. Many of the accusers were drawn from Paris's circle in the village, those who felt marginalized and threatened by the growing wealth of their neighbors. What looked like a battle against witches was also a battle for the future of Salem. Would it remain a pious, insular community, or would it become a place shaped by commerce, trade, and a loosening of Puritan control? The gallows became the stage upon which this struggle played out. It is easy to view the Salem witch trials as a story of mass hysteria, but beneath the hysteria was calculation. To accuse someone of witchcraft was to eliminate a rival, silence a critic, or seize land. To confess was to escape death and redirect suspicion toward others. To remain silent was to risk ruin. Every choice was political, and every accusation was a move in a brutal game of survival. Salem's tragedy was that these political maneuvers were cloaked in the language of faith. Neighbors were not merely rivals, they were agents of Satan. Disputes were not about wages, property, or power, they were battles for the soul of the community. In this way, ordinary quarrels were transformed into apocalyptic struggles, and the smallest resentment could erupt into lethal accusation. The dark politics behind the trials ensured that they would not burn out quickly. Each new accusation opened new opportunities. Each new confession tightened the grip of the court. And as long as the leaders of Salem and Massachusetts found advantage in the trials, they continued. For the people of Salem, there was no escaping the web. Politics, religion, and fear had fused together, creating a force that swept through the village like a storm, destroying reputations, families, and lives. Behind every cry of witch was not only fear of the devil but also the quiet calculation of human ambition. In the courts of Salem, truth was not measured by logic or by physical proof. It was measured by fear, by belief, and by visions that could never be verified. At the heart of the trials lay one of the strangest and most dangerous practices in legal history, the use of spectral evidence. Spectral evidence meant that if a person claimed to see the spirit or specter of someone tormenting them in a dream or a vision, that testimony could be used in court as proof of witchcraft. In other words, if a girl collapsed in a fit and cried out that she saw the ghost of her neighbor standing over her, the court treated it as fact, even if the accused was standing in the room at the very moment the accusation was made. The invisible became visible through words alone, and the word of the afflicted carried more weight than the life of the accused. This bizarre system of justice reflected the Puritans' deep conviction that the devil could manipulate the world through unseen forces. To them, there was no hard boundary between the physical and the spiritual. If someone's ghost appeared in a dream, it was not imagined, it was evidence that the person had allied with Satan and was projecting their spirit to harm others. The afflicted girls became living barometers of witchcraft. Their screams, spasms, and visions in court were treated not as theater but as testimony. The more violently they convulsed, the more the judges believed. Ordinary people, powerless to defend themselves against invisible accusations, were trapped in a system that made denial sound like confirmation. The reliance on spectral evidence opened the door to endless accusations. Anyone could claim to see anyone else in a vision, and there was no way to disprove it. If the afflicted cried out in court, the accused was presumed guilty unless they could somehow prove otherwise, a nearly impossible task. The accused could swear their innocence, quote scripture, or pray aloud, but even these actions could be turned against them. If they stumbled over their words, it was seen as Satan confusing their tongue. If they remained calm, it was interpreted as the devil giving them strength. The rules bent in only one direction, toward guilt. Alongside spectral testimony, the courts entertained other strange methods of detecting witches. Villagers baked witch cakes, mixing rye meal with the urine of the afflicted and feeding it to dogs. If the dog displayed fits similar to the girls, it was taken as proof of witchcraft. Touch tests were another method. If a victim was seized with convulsions and the accused laid a hand upon them, a sudden calming of the victim was seen as evidence that the witch's spirit had been reabsorbed into the body. These practices blurred the line between superstition and justice, allowing rituals and rumors to take the place of evidence. The testimonies themselves grew more elaborate as the trials went on. The afflicted described being pricked with invisible pins, choked by unseen hands, and dragged through the air by specters. They claimed witches rode on poles or gathered in dark assemblies to sign the devil's book. Strange animals, black dogs, yellow birds, cats with human faces, were said to accompany witches as familiars, sucking blood from hidden marks on their skin. Each tale, no matter how bizarre, was accepted by judges and ministers who believed that Satan's powers knew no bounds. To reject the evidence would be to reject the very possibility that the devil was real, and that was unthinkable in Puritan New England. For the accused, the presence of such evidence was devastating. How could a farmer prove that his ghost had not appeared in someone's dream? How could a midwife prove that a miscarriage was not caused by her specter's hand? The very structure of the trials left no room for rational defense. Even the most respected members of the community, church elders, devout women, landowners, found themselves powerless when spectral testimony was turned against them. Their reputations, built over decades, crumbled in moments before the spectacle of screaming children. What made this reliance on invisible proof so dangerous was the way it legitimized hysteria. Once the courts declared that dreams and visions counted as evidence, there was no limit to what could be claimed. The afflicted girls learned quickly that their fits and visions could sway entire proceedings. Every gasp, every shriek, every fall to the floor was treated as sacred testimony. Their bodies became instruments of the court, and the trials turned into theater. Crowds packed the meeting houses, watching as the afflicted performed convulsions, pointed trembling fingers, and cried out the names of neighbors. The line between performance and belief blurred, but it did not matter. The effect was the same: more accusations, more arrests, and more death sentences. There were moments, even in the height of hysteria, when doubts surfaced. Some ministers warned that the devil could take the shape of innocent people, meaning that spectral visions might not prove guilt at all. If Satan could impersonate anyone, then the afflicted girl's visions could implicate even the righteous. But these warnings were often drowned out by louder voices demanding swift action. For men like Chief Justice Stoughton, spectral evidence was not only acceptable but necessary, a divine weapon in the war against witches. To question it was to weaken the fight against Satan. And so, the machinery of the trials ground on, fueled by visions that no one could see but everyone was forced to believe. The reliance on the devil's evidence turned Salem's courtrooms into a nightmare world where the intangible held more power than the tangible, where unseen ghosts were more convincing than flesh-and-blood witnesses. The trials revealed the dangers of a society that allowed fear to outweigh reason, and belief to override fact. For the accused, it was a trap with no escape. Their innocence could not be proven, their guilt could not be disproven, and every denial only tightened the noose around their necks. In Salem, the devil needed no proof, his shadow was enough to kill. For those accused of witchcraft, the horror did not begin on the gallows. It began the moment their names were spoken aloud and the constables arrived at their door. The accused were dragged from their homes, often in the presence of their children, and taken to be interrogated. Shackles were clamped onto their wrists and ankles, heavy irons that cut into the skin. Families could do little but watch as their loved ones were carted off to crowded jails where darkness, disease, and despair ruled every hour of the day. For many, the trial was only the final act in a nightmare that had already broken their spirit. The jails of Massachusetts in 1692 were not built to house large numbers of prisoners. They were crude, filthy structures meant for short stays, not long incarcerations. Yet hundreds of accused witches found themselves crammed inside, awaiting trial or execution. The air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, human waste, and moldy straw. Rats scurried across the floors, and lice infested the prisoners' clothing. There was little food, and what existed had to be paid for by the families of the accused. Those without money often starved. Even water was scarce, and prisoners relied on guards or family members for the bare minimum to survive. The cruelty extended beyond mere neglect. Shackles and chains were not just used to prevent escape but to break the spirit of the accused. Prisoners were bound in iron so heavy they could barely move, their ankles swollen and raw from the weight. Some were chained to the walls in darkness for weeks. The authorities charged prisoners for the very chains that bound them, adding crushing debt to the misery of captivity. If someone survived the ordeal and was released, they often returned home penniless, their possessions seized to pay for the costs of imprisonment. To be accused was to risk not only your life but your family's livelihood, as debts piled up while crops withered in neglected fields. Women made up the majority of the accused, and their suffering in jail was often doubled by the circumstances of their gender. Pregnant women were confined in chains, forced to endure childbirth in the filthy conditions of the jail. Infants born in captivity sometimes died within days, their frail bodies unable to withstand the cold and hunger. Children of the accused were not spared either. In some cases, they were imprisoned alongside their mothers, enduring the same squalor and fear. In others, they were left to fend for themselves, shunned by neighbors who feared association with witchcraft. The stigma of accusation extended far beyond the walls of the jail, condemning entire families to shame and ruin. The accused endured relentless psychological torment as well. Every day, ministers visited the cells, urging them to confess. Confession, they were told, would save their souls and perhaps their lives, though in truth it often only prolonged their suffering. Those who confessed were forced to accuse others, spreading the web of hysteria further. Those who refused to confess, who clung to their innocence, were left to rot in chains, knowing that their silence likely meant the noose. This constant pressure wore down even the strongest. A simple word of admission could mean the difference between life and death, but to speak it was to betray the truth and condemn others. It was a trap with no way out. Among the prisoners were the elderly and the infirm, people who could barely walk, much less threaten their neighbors with sorcery. They wasted away in the jails, their bodies frail, their minds bewildered by the accusations leveled against them. Some died before they could ever be tried, their names forgotten, their deaths recorded only in passing. Yet even in death, their families were not spared. The bodies of prisoners were often returned only after fees were paid, and in some cases, families were denied the chance to bury their dead at all. The system of accusation and imprisonment was not only about rooting out witches, it was about grinding down the spirit of an entire community. Food, blankets, even straw to sleep on came at a cost. If families could not pay, the accused went without. Guards often abused their power, demanding bribes for basic kindness or relief from suffering. The economic burden destroyed many households, leaving widows and orphans destitute even if their accused family members eventually returned. In this way, the trials punished not just the accused but entire lineages, branding them with shame and burying them in debt. The stories of the accused reveal the human cost behind the hysteria. Imagine the terror of a mother locked in darkness while her children wept outside, unable to help. Imagine the shame of a farmer whose property was seized, his family left homeless because he could not pay for the irons around his ankles. Imagine the desperation of a prisoner forced to confess lies against neighbors, knowing that by saving themselves they might condemn someone else to die. These were the everyday horrors of Salem, a slow, grinding cruelty that rarely makes it into the simplified retellings of history. Even for those who survived imprisonment, freedom came with scars. Released prisoners often returned to communities that no longer welcomed them. They were whispered about, shunned, and avoided. Their property was gone, their health ruined, their faith shaken. Families of the accused carried the stigma for generations, their names associated with the shame of witchcraft long after the trials ended. In some cases, restitution was offered decades later, but no amount of money could erase the years of torment or restore the lives lost in filthy cells. The jail cells of Salem were as much a theater of cruelty as the gallows. They revealed how deeply fear had corrupted the community, transforming neighbors into jailers and faith into a weapon. The people imprisoned there were not monsters or witches but ordinary men and women caught in a storm they could not escape. Their daily suffering, hidden behind the wooden walls of the jails, was a slower kind of death than the gallows but no less destructive. Salem's tragedy was not only written in executions but in the silent misery of those who endured every day in chains, waiting for a verdict that would likely end in their death. When the sentences were handed down, Salem transformed into a theater of death. Execution days were public spectacles, staged not only to punish the condemned but to terrify those who remained. The condemned were led from their cells in chains, stumbling along dirt paths toward Gallows Hill, a barren rise outside the village where the wind cut across the stones and the grass grew thin. There was no attempt at privacy, no effort to hide the brutality. The whole community turned out to watch. Parents held children by the hand, neighbors gathered in silence, ministers stood ready with Bibles, and guards marched solemnly with their captives. To see a witch put to death was meant to strengthen faith, to remind the people that God's justice would not be mocked. Yet beneath the sermons and solemnity was a spectacle as cruel as it was calculated. The hangings themselves were grim and methodical. The condemned were often bound and carted to the site, where a crude wooden gallows stood against the sky. Ropes were prepared in advance, the nooses swaying gently in the breeze as though waiting for their victims. The accused were given a chance to confess and repent, urged by ministers to save their souls at the last possible moment. Some prayed, their voices trembling, while others stood defiant, proclaiming their innocence to the very end. The crowd leaned in to hear their final words, words that might either confirm the devil's power or reveal God's grace. Then the cart was pulled away, and the body dropped. The sound of the rope tightening, the gasp of the crowd, the twisting of the body in midair, these were the sights and sounds that seared themselves into memory. The execution of Bridget Bishop, the first to hang, set the tone. She was a woman known for her independence, her colorful clothing, her tavern, and her sharp tongue. To many in Salem, she was already suspect, her lifestyle defying Puritan expectations of modesty and submission. When she mounted the gallows in June 1692, the community witnessed not only the punishment of a supposed witch but the public destruction of a woman who had refused to conform. Her death announced that anyone who stood apart from Salem's rigid norms could meet the same fate. The executions came in waves, each one escalating the sense of dread. Sarah Good, hanged in July, cursed her judges to their faces, declaring they would one day burn in hell for their cruelty. Rebecca Nurse, a deeply respected elder of the church, met her end with quiet dignity, her execution shaking the faith of those who had believed only the guilty would die. When George Burroughs, a former minister, was accused and sentenced, he shocked the crowd by perfectly reciting the Lord's Prayer on the gallows, something witches were believed incapable of doing. For a moment, the onlookers hesitated. Was he truly guilty? Could such a prayer come from the lips of a servant of Satan? But Chief Justice Stoughton quickly silenced the doubt, declaring it a trick of the devil. The execution proceeded, and with it, the community's conscience was further numbed. Perhaps the most brutal death was reserved for Giles Corey. Refusing to enter a plea when accused, he was pressed to death under heavy stones in a field near the jail. The punishment was meant to force him to speak, but Giles remained silent, his only words a defiant demand for more weight. His slow, crushing death became one of the darkest symbols of the trials, a man literally ground beneath the weight of his community's fear and vengeance. His silence preserved his estate for his family, but his agony revealed the merciless extremes to which the courts were willing to go. The executions were not only punishments, they were warnings. Each hanging reminded the villagers that silence could be deadly, that loyalty to accused friends or family could cost one's life. The sight of neighbors swinging from ropes kept dissent buried. Children watched with wide eyes, learning the cost of speaking out. Families of the condemned were often forced to stand in the crowd, humiliated and broken as their loved ones were branded as agents of Satan. The message was clear: to survive, you must conform, you must obey, you must never question. The staging of executions also reinforced the power of the authorities. Ministers prayed loudly, framing the deaths as victories of God over Satan. Judges stood solemnly, their authority heightened by the spectacle of submission. Each death was meant to cleanse the community, to purge the infection of witchcraft. But far from purging, the execution spread fear like a contagion. Every new body at Gallows Hill made the hysteria harder to deny. If so many had died, surely the threat must be real. Each rope that tightened around a neck pulled the noose tighter around the conscience of Salem itself. The condemned met their ends in different ways, some with curses, some with prayers, some with silence, but all with dignity stolen from them by the machinery of hysteria. They were denied proper burials, their bodies cut down and thrown into shallow graves near the site of their execution. Families who attempted to recover the corpses often did so under the cover of night, sneaking to Gallows Hill to claim their dead before guards or neighbors could interfere. Even in death, the accused were treated as outcasts, their names blackened, their memory tainted. For the living, the image of the gallows lingered long after the trials ended. The hill itself became a place of shame, avoided by many, whispered about by children. Ministers rarely spoke of it in sermons, preferring to erase the stain rather than confront it. But the memory could not be erased from those who had watched neighbors die, or from the families who carried the grief in silence. Salem was scarred not only by the injustice of the accusations but by the cruel spectacle of its executions, where ordinary men and women were displayed as monsters and destroyed before their community's eyes. The executions at Gallows Hill were more than punishments. They were theater, a public ritual of fear designed to enforce obedience and silence dissent. They revealed the darkest side of the trials, where justice became spectacle and faith became a weapon. The nooses tightened not only around the condemned but around Salem itself, strangling trust, compassion, and humanity. Each life taken was not just a tragedy for the individual but a wound to the soul of the community, a wound that would never fully heal. When the story of the Salem Witch Trials is told, the spotlight usually falls on the infamous executions, the hanged women on Gallows Hill, the crushed body of Giles Corey, the dramatic courtroom fits of the afflicted girls. But hidden in the shadows are those who suffered quietly, those whose names never entered the history books or whose fates were lost amid the frenzy. These were the forgotten victims, the men, women, and children who endured the torment of accusation without ever reaching the gallows, who perished in the cold silence of jail cells, or who lived on, scarred by shame and poverty long after the hysteria had passed. Many prisoners never made it to trial. Conditions in the jails were so brutal that disease, malnutrition, and despair claimed lives before the judges could. Sarah Osborne, one of the very first accused, never stood on Gallows Hill. She died shackled in a Boston jail, her body broken by illness after months of confinement. Others shared her fate, quietly expiring behind wooden walls, their deaths recorded only in brief lines of court records or parish notes. These victims vanished without the notoriety of execution, but their suffering was no less profound. For their families, there was no closure, only the bitter knowledge that their loved ones had wasted away in chains, condemned by fear and forgotten by history. Children, too, bore the brunt of suspicion. Some were directly accused, forced to endure interrogations and confinement despite their tender years. Dorothy Good, the 4-year-old daughter of Sarah Good, was arrested after the afflicted girls claimed to see her specter. A toddler, barely able to speak, was locked in a dark cell, terrorized by questions she could not comprehend. She survived, but the experience left lasting scars. She grew into adulthood marked by mental illness, her life forever shaped by the trauma of being branded a witch before she had even learned to read. Her story is a chilling reminder that in Salem, no one was too young to escape suspicion, and innocence was no shield against hysteria. The forgotten victims were not always the accused themselves but the families left behind. Wives lost husbands, children lost mothers, farms lay untended, and households crumbled under the weight of absence. When an accused was jailed, their family was often left destitute. Livestock starved, crops rotted, debts mounted. Neighbors, fearful of association, refused to help. A family's very name became poisoned. Even after release, the stigma lingered. Families struggled to reclaim land, to pay off debts from jail fees, to convince neighbors to trust them again. Some never succeeded. Entire lineages were tarnished by the stain of witchcraft, their descendants carrying the weight of accusations they had never earned. Among the most overlooked victims were women whose only crime was their independence. Widows who managed their own property, midwives who held knowledge of healing, women who spoke their minds, all found themselves easy targets in a society that mistrusted female autonomy. Their names may not appear in every textbook, but their stories reveal a pattern of punishment that went beyond superstition. They were casualties of a culture that equated power with sin when it appeared in the hands of women. For them, accusation was not only spiritual condemnation but social execution, a deliberate silencing of voices that refused to conform. There were also those who, though not formally accused, lived under the shadow of suspicion. Friends of the condemned, neighbors who dared to defend them, ministers who questioned the validity of spectral evidence, all risked being drawn into the web. Some chose silence to save themselves, but others spoke out and paid dearly. Their reputations were destroyed, their livelihoods ruined. They were not executed, but they became outcasts, haunted by their defiance. These silent resistors, often overlooked in retellings, represent a quieter form of victimhood, the price of conscience in a world ruled by fear. For every execution that seared itself into collective memory, there were dozens of hidden tragedies: the infant who died in a prison cell because his mother had been accused, the elderly woman who wasted away on moldy straw, the farmer who returned from jail to find his land seized and his family scattered. These stories lack the dramatic climax of the gallows, but they embody the deeper cruelty of the trials. Salem did not only kill, it eroded, starved, and broke people slowly. Even decades later, when the hysteria had ended and the courts admitted their mistakes, many of the forgotten victims received little or no restitution. Some families petitioned the government for financial compensation, but the payments, when they came, were small and symbolic, far less than the losses endured. Others never received acknowledgement at all. The shame lingered through generations, whispered about but never healed. For descendants, the legacy of Salem was not just a tale of witches and gallows but a family history scarred by injustice and silence. To remember only the executed is to miss the full scale of Salem's tragedy. The witch trials consumed far more than the lives taken on Gallows Hill. They consumed dignity, families, futures, and the quiet lives of those who never received justice. The forgotten victims remind us that history is often told through its loudest moments, but its deepest wounds lie in the silences, in the names erased from records, in the children who grew up broken, in the families who carried shame into the next century. They are the ghosts that linger behind the famous stories, the voices drowned out by the roar of hysteria. The forgotten victims of Salem teach us that the true cost of hysteria cannot be measured only in executions. It must also be measured in the lives shattered quietly, in the ordinary people who suffered invisibly, in the countless tragedies that never made it to the gallows. These were the human faces hidden behind statistics, the silent majority of Salem's nightmare. Their suffering is harder to dramatize, but it is no less vital to remember. Without them, the story of Salem is incomplete. By the late summer of 1692, the frenzy that had once seemed unstoppable began to show cracks. The very machinery of accusation that had consumed Salem with such ferocity began to turn in on itself, and for the first time, people whispered doubts about whether the courts were pursuing justice or committing a terrible mistake. The unraveling of the Salem Witch Trials did not come with a sudden revelation, but with a series of moments when the hysteria stretched too far, ensnaring people whose innocence seemed impossible to deny. The most striking example was the execution of Rebecca Nurse. A 71-year-old grandmother, Nurse was widely respected for her piety and kindness. She had been a pillar of her church, a woman whose reputation for virtue was beyond question. When she was accused, many in the community were stunned. At her trial, she carried herself with quiet dignity, denying the charges and maintaining her innocence to the end. For a time, it seemed she might be spared. The jury initially found her not guilty. But under pressure from the afflicted girls and the court, the verdict was reversed, and she was condemned. Her execution sent a tremor of unease through Salem. If someone like Rebecca Nurse could be guilty, then no one was safe. Her death planted the first seeds of doubt in minds that had previously accepted the trials without question. That doubt deepened with the trial of George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem Village. Burroughs had once been a spiritual leader in the community, though his stern style and personal conflicts had left him unpopular. Still, when he was brought to the gallows, something extraordinary happened. Standing before the crowd, he recited the Lord's Prayer flawlessly, a prayer believed to be impossible for a witch to utter. The executioners hesitated. The onlookers murmured. Could a servant of Satan truly call upon God with such power? For a moment, it seemed the spell of hysteria might break. But Chief Justice William Stoughton silenced the doubts, declaring that the devil was capable of deceiving even the faithful. Burroughs was hanged, but the moment could not be erased. Many who had witnessed it carried a new unease, the thought that perhaps the courts were destroying the innocent. The reliance on spectral evidence also began to unravel under scrutiny. Ministers and scholars who had supported the trials grew increasingly uneasy with the use of visions and dreams as proof of guilt. Reverend Increase Mather, one of the most prominent clergymen in New England, warned that it were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned. His words carried weight, and others began to echo them. If the devil could impersonate innocent people, as some argued, then how could any accusation based on spectral evidence be trusted? What had once seemed certain now seemed dangerously flawed. As the circle of accusations widened, the hysteria began to threaten those in power. The afflicted girls, emboldened by the court's acceptance of their visions, did not stop at neighbors and outcasts. They began pointing fingers at people of higher status, wealthy merchants, respected ministers, even the wife of the colony's governor, Lady Mary Phipps. This was a turning point. To accuse the poor was one thing, but to accuse the elite was another. The very people who had supported the trials now saw their own safety endangered. What had begun as a weapon against rivals and outsiders had become a force that no one could control. By the autumn of 1692, public opinion was shifting. Executions had grown more frequent, and the spectacle of death no longer reassured the community, it haunted it. Families who had lost loved ones spoke out. Ministers who had once thundered against witches began to hesitate. The constant stream of accusations no longer inspired trust but suspicion. Perhaps the afflicted girls were exaggerating, perhaps the courts were too eager to condemn. The credibility of the trials was cracking, not from a single blow but from the accumulation of doubt, grief, and fear. The unraveling was not only moral but practical. The jails were overflowing with prisoners. Farms lay neglected, families were impoverished, and the colony itself was strained by the sheer number of trials and executions. The system could not sustain itself indefinitely. Authorities who had once encouraged the hysteria began to look for a way out. Governor William Phips, alarmed by the growing chaos and by the fact that his own household had been touched by accusations, intervened. He ordered a halt to the use of spectral evidence and eventually dissolved the special court that had overseen the trials. Without spectral testimony, the cases collapsed. The executions slowed, then stopped. Prisoners were gradually released, though many remained burdened by debts from their confinement. The tide of hysteria that had swept through Salem for months finally receded, leaving devastation in its wake. Families were broken, reputations destroyed, and the community deeply divided. The unraveling had come not because Salem suddenly regained its reason, but because the panic had overreached, touching people and institutions powerful enough to resist it. Yet even as the trials ended, there was little public acknowledgement of error. The authorities moved quickly to silence criticism, to bury the shame rather than confront it. Ministers who had once championed the executions now preached forgetfulness. Judges who had condemned the innocent claimed they had been misled. The unraveling of the trials did not bring justice for the victims, it merely brought an end to the killing. Salem was left scarred, its trust shattered, its faith shaken, and its name forever bound to a tragedy that could not be undone. The collapse of the trials revealed what hysteria could never admit, that the fear of witches had never been about truth or justice, but about power, control, and the fragility of human judgment. The unraveling was not a triumph of reason but a retreat from chaos, a desperate effort to stop a fire that had already consumed too much. For the forgotten victims, it came too late. But for Salem, it marked the moment when doubt finally pierced the armor of fear, and the community awoke to the horror of what it had done. When the executions stopped and the hysteria began to fade, Salem was left with a silence far more haunting than the cries of the accused. The village had witnessed neighbors hanged, families ruined, and reputations destroyed, and yet there was no great reckoning, no sweeping confession of guilt from the authorities who had driven the madness. Instead, there was shame, carried quietly by survivors and descendants, a wound that bled through generations. The legacy of Salem was not only the memory of the gallows but the silence that followed, a silence heavy with unspoken grief and unanswered questions. For those who had survived imprisonment, life after the trials was not freedom but exile. Many returned to homes stripped bare, their property seized to pay debts from jail fees. They bore the stigma of accusation even after their release, their names whispered in suspicion for years to come. A woman once accused of witchcraft was not easily welcomed back into the fold of the community. Her neighbors remembered the visions, the screams, the accusations that had condemned her, and even if she had escaped execution, her reputation rarely escaped intact. For men, the shame was often tied to ruined farms and lost livelihoods, while for women, it was bound to a social identity scarred beyond repair. To be accused was to carry a mark, invisible yet permanent. The families of those executed faced an even harsher legacy. Their grief was compounded by poverty, for the condemned were denied proper burials, their bodies cast into shallow, unmarked graves. Families who tried to reclaim the remains of loved ones often had to do so in secret, sneaking under cover of night to Gallows Hill. Children grew up with the memory of parents branded as witches, their family names forever tainted. Descendants carried the burden of those accusations for generations, long after the trials had ended. To marry into a family touched by witchcraft was risky, the stain of suspicion could linger for decades. The trials had not only taken lives but had poisoned bloodlines, leaving scars that reached far into the future. The authorities who had presided over the trials were reluctant to admit fault. Chief Justice William Stoughton, who had overseen the executions, never expressed regret, convinced to his death that he had acted rightly in the service of God. Other judges distanced themselves, claiming they had been deceived by false testimony. Ministers who had thundered against witches shifted their tone, urging the community to move on rather than dwell on past mistakes. The colony's leaders issued half-hearted gestures of contrition, but these came years later, and by then, the damage was beyond repair. The silence of those in power ensured that the shame of Salem festered rather than healed. Yet there were attempts, however small, to acknowledge the injustice. In 1697, the colony declared a day of fasting and repentance for the sins of the trials, a solemn recognition that something terrible had occurred. Some ministers confessed publicly to their errors, though often with the caveat that they had acted with good intentions. A few judges expressed remorse, but only privately, and never with the force that matched the devastation they had unleashed. In the early 18th century, families of the condemned petitioned for restitution, and some were granted small payments as compensation for lost property and wrongful imprisonment. But money could not replace lives lost, nor erase the humiliation carried for years. These efforts felt less like justice and more like a colony trying to soothe its conscience without reopening the wounds. The shame of Salem endured in silence because the trials had revealed something terrifying about human nature. The people of Salem had not been strangers to one another, they were neighbors, kin, fellow churchgoers. And yet, under pressure and fear, they had turned against each other with astonishing speed. To admit the horror of what had been done was to admit that ordinary men and women were capable of destroying their own community in the name of righteousness. It was easier to forget, to bury the memory beneath layers of piety and denial, than to confront the truth that the devil had never needed to walk in Salem. Human fear and ambition had been enough. Over time, the trials were woven into the cultural fabric of New England in complicated ways. For many years, they were remembered with embarrassment, a chapter best left unspoken. But as generations passed, Salem's tragedy became a cautionary tale, a story of mass hysteria used to teach lessons about justice, faith, and human weakness. In the 19th and 20th centuries, writers and historians revived the story, transforming it into a symbol of the dangers of fanaticism. Plays, books, and essays turned the trials into moral allegories, cautioning against blind obedience and the power of fear. Arthur Miller's The Crucible, written during the Red Scare of the 1950s, cast Salem as a mirror for modern witch hunts, showing that hysteria was not confined to the past but was an ever-present danger. Meanwhile, Salem itself eventually embraced its dark legacy in ways that would have shocked its Puritan founders. The city that once executed supposed witches became a place where witchcraft was commodified, celebrated, and turned into an industry. Today, tourists flock to Salem to see museums, reenactments, and souvenirs, drawn by the haunting fascination of its past. Halloween transforms the city into a carnival of witches, ghosts, and spirits, blending history with spectacle. For some, this commercialization is a betrayal of the real suffering endured, for others, it is a way to reclaim a story that once brought only shame. The irony is inescapable, the community that once sought to erase the memory of witchcraft now profits from it. But beneath the tourism and the popular retellings, the deeper legacy remains, a warning about what happens when fear overtakes reason, when justice is bent by hysteria, and when human weakness hides behind claims of righteousness. The silence and shame of Salem remind us that hysteria does not need witches to thrive, it only needs fear, division, and the willingness to sacrifice truth for the illusion of safety. The legacy is not only about 1692 but about every moment in history when suspicion and paranoia have driven communities to destroy themselves from within. The people of Salem never fully escaped the shadow of what they had done. Generations carried the weight, families whispered of lost ancestors, and the community struggled with its identity long after the trials ended. The gallows were gone, the courts dissolved, but the shame lingered like an unquiet ghost. Salem's legacy is a story not only of what was done in the heat of fear but of what was left unsaid in the cold aftermath, the apologies never spoken, the names never cleared, the grief never fully acknowledged. It is a legacy of silence and shame, echoing through history as a warning that once fear takes hold, no community is safe from turning against itself.